Welcome, everybody, to the third in our interview series of Hymn Society leaders. My name is Mike McMahon, and I'm the Executive Director of the Hymn Society. And today I am so delighted to be having this opportunity to have a conversation with Dr. James Abbington. I think I've personally known Jimmy for more than 25 years.
That's right.
And I've always known him to be a person, with great insights, wonderful musicianship. He's a committed guy, shows great leadership, and always acts with integrity, everything he does. So I'm really, I think so highly of him, and I'm glad to have this opportunity to talk to him today. He's currently the Associate Professor of Church Music and Worship at Candler School of Theology at Emory University in Atlanta. He has a long list of important teaching positions, hymnal projects, books and articles, conference leadership, hands-on conducting and playing for churches, universities, denominations, and other organizations. Among some of his more significant contributions are 3 hymnal projects, including the second edition of Lead Me, Guide Me, the African American Heritage Hymnal, and more recently, One Lord, One Faith, One Baptism, which is a really wonderful project of an ecumenical hymnal among African American leaders of 7 denominations. And so anyway, I could go on, but then we would take all of our time. So welcome, Jimmy. It's really so nice to be talking to you today.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you for such a generous introduction. Always good to see you.
You're welcome. I could go on too. I was wondering though, if we could go back and start with your growing up. I think people would be interested to hear about how you grew up and some of the early influences on you with regard to church and music.
Well, I grew up in a little coal mining town in West Virginia. It was called Gary. In fact, when I was out of town or out of the state, and I would tell someone that I was from Gary, West Virginia, and they said, "Oh, isn't that right outside of Chicago?" So I would always have to say, "No, that's Gary, Indiana. I'm in the big city, Gary, West Virginia." So I grew up in a little small coal mining town there. I didn't realize how blessed I was to be in a little town like Gary, where coal mining was the main industry. My father was a miner there for U.S. Steel, but it was a church full of churches. A community full of churches, I should say. A church almost on every side of, well, I can't say on the blocks because there weren't that many blocks, but on the sides of the hills and on the sides of the mountains and on the sides of roads. And I grew up in an apostolic church, apostolic temple, a little church up on the hill on the other side of the railroad tracks, and just had access to an incredible elementary, secondary education, introduced to people who were great musicians and inspired me to do so, to become a musician. My mother was a singer. She played the piano. I always tell people that I was a church baby. I was literally born on the pew. And at any point that I got out of control, I might get a hymnal thrown back at me from the piano from my mother on the first pew. But it was a great place to be born. It was a great place to really develop a love and appreciation for the church and for hymnody that I certainly experienced right there in that little Pentecostal church in West Virginia, and subsequently the Baptist churches and other churches that I encountered. So goes all back to Gary, West Virginia.
That is so cool. And you did you go to, when you went to college, you went to study music?
Yes. Well, when I started, and rarely do I talk about this, but I had all kinds of scholarships to go to West Virginia State College, which is now West Virginia State University, down in Institute, West Virginia. And I was there for about 3 semesters. And the late Wendell Whalum came through town to the First Baptist Church of Charleston, where I was a musician, and I knew all roads led to Morehouse College. And by January of 1980, I was at Morehouse College, enrolled, and became the accompanist of the Morehouse Glee Club. And that's kind of how I got to Atlanta, and kind of my life bloomed musically there.
How did that change your musical life?
Oh, tremendously. Ironically, at age 18, I was appointed. As I look back over it now, I just, I'm like, how in the world did those people put up with this? But at 18, I came to Charleston to be a student at West Virginia State and became the director of the sanctuary choir, of all things, of the First Baptist Church of Charleston, which was the largest Black Baptist congregation in the state of West Virginia. And many of the people in the choir were professors at the college or public school teachers or very professional folks in the community. And here I was, the new kid on the block, the director. So I didn't get to do much playing around other than, well, at least playing around in the streets. I did a lot of playing around in church and at the college and university. But when I met Dr. Whalum, that choir did anthems and spirituals. So there was a musical discipline that was demanded even at a very young age. I mean, consistently, that the choir had to be prepared to sing anthems, spirituals, hymns of the church every week. And it was there that I met him, that I think my life began to really change musically, because I wanted to be like him. I wanted to play like him. I wanted to conduct like him. I wanted to be one of his prize students. And of course, that move to Atlanta provided me all of those opportunities. I remember going there. It was actually in West Virginia that I fell in love with the pipe organ, hearing them being played in Charleston at non-African-American churches. But when I got to Morehouse, I knew that Dr. Whalum was an organist. And the one thing that I asked was, when I get there, I want a church that has a pipe organ. And he says, we can arrange that. And of all the churches that were looking for an organist at that time, it was the West Hunter Street Baptist Church, where the late Ralph David Abernathy was the pastor. So imagine, a 19-year-old coming to Atlanta, and my first church job is organist at West Hunter Street Baptist Church. Had a beautiful 3-manual 48 rank Reuter pipe organ, and Dr. Whalum began teaching me there. So as I said, it was when I came to Atlanta that life really blossomed.
And you also served at Historic Ebenezer, didn't you not?
Absolutely. I was church organist at West Hunter Street Baptist Church, which required that I play on first, third, and fourth Sundays. So I had a second Sunday free, and Dr. Whalum at that time said, we really need you at Ebenezer, where he was at that time the music director. And so he says, I'd like for you to, they're looking for someone to accompany the MLK choir. So, Dr. Whalum said it, I did it. So before I realized, I was at the historic Ebenezer Baptist Church, where Martin Luther King and Daddy King had pastored for years. Of course, Daddy King was still alive at that time. And eventually, when the director resigned and went on, I became the director of that choir through my years at Morehouse College. And so I was probably one of the few students that could say that I played at Ralph Abernathy and Martin Luther King's church as a student.
That is quite impressive.
Yeah.
And I read that when you were leaving to go to graduate school at the University of Michigan, that Dr. Martin Luther King Sr. had something to say to you.
Oh, yeah. I was so excited. I was in Michigan. We were on tour with the Glee Club. And I went out to Ann Arbor and auditioned, and Marilyn Mason welcomed me in Michigan. And I was just floating on air and calling people and letting them know I'm going to Michigan. I'm going to study with Marilyn Mason. The folks in Atlanta heard about it. My teachers were excited. Dr. Whalum was proud. And I got back to the church and told the ministers, well, Ralph Abernathy was not as excited, nor was Reverend Joe Roberts, who was the pastor of Ebenezer at that time, but he knew Charles Adams, who was the pastor of Hartford Memorial Baptist Church, and knew that he was looking for an organist, so that this would be an opportunity. Well, everything was okay until Daddy King got the word. And so everybody said, well, what did Daddy King say? I said, well, I don't know. What do you mean, what did Daddy King say? Oh, he said, well, you need to see what Daddy King thinks about it. So sure enough, one day I was there in the sanctuary practicing all alone, and I felt this very godly presence in the back of the church, and I could hear this cane, but the cane was coming toward the organ. And so I said, oh my God, I think that's Daddy King. So sure enough, he came up to the organ, said, what's this I'm hearing around church about you leaving here, going to Michigan? And so I said, oh yes, Daddy King, I'm going to Michigan to study at the University of Michigan. I'm going to be studying organ with whatever. And he looked at me as if to say, and why should I be impressed with that? And so he said, well, why can't you learn how to, you play the organ fine. Wait, you stay down here to learn what you need to with Dr. Whalen. You don't have to go to Michigan. And I went on to talk about Marilyn Mason and this scholarship. And Daddy King was totally unmoved by my enthusiasm. And so I went on and on. He sat there and looked, and he said, well, I guess you're going, but you go on up there. You go on up there, learn all of that Bach and Beethoven and Brahms, whatever they teach you. But don't you ever, and he shook his finger in my face, forget how to play Amazing Grace. And I said, yes, sir. And I'm sitting there trembling, as a little college student. He said, now play it for me, son. And so I began improvising on Amazing Grace, and he walked away from the organ. So I guess that was my full authority that I could leave Atlanta and go to the University of Michigan for grad school.
Well, those words have clearly stuck with you over all these years.
Oh, right? Yeah. Don't ever forget how to play Amazing Grace.
You went on to Michigan and did your doctorate there with Marilyn Mason. And you spent a lot of your career as an educator. And yeah. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, what that's been like for you, the kinds of experiences you've had with students and what you're seeing out there.
Well, Mike, that is true to an extent. And I have been now full-time in academia since 1998, which is about 20 years, a little over 20 years. And God knows I could say more about that. But I spent a lot of my years at Michigan doing church. I would tell students that I encountered, be careful in your graduate studies that you don't begin to major in the minor and minor in the major. There was a period of time where I was the music director at the Hartford Memorial Baptist Church, the largest Black Baptist church in the city of Detroit, in the state of Michigan. And that church was growing so rapidly that I became overwhelmed with all that was going on in the church, and discovered that my graduate studies suffered. So it was not until I think a significant point in my studies that I knew, or I should say that God began to trouble the nest. The eagle stirs the nest. I love that sermon and that analogy. And it was clear that I needed to finish my work at Michigan, and that I needed to really go into academia, which was my heart. And so it was full-time academia in 1998, where I went to little HBCU in Raleigh, North Carolina, Shaw University, and became the director of choral activities and the chairman of the Department of Visual and Performing Arts. That I really stepped into academia full-time, and church work kind of became secondary. And I loved it. And over the years, when I look back over my students and the progress that they've made, there is no paycheck that could have brought more joy or been more rewarding, more beneficial than the work. And to see those students that came into you as I came into Morehouse, now progressing. In fact, I just arrived back in town last night from Minneapolis, Minnesota, where one of my former students from Morehouse, who took Introduction to Church Music class, who was the accompanist of the Glee Club, who's also a staff singer in my church choir in Atlanta, who is now at 29 years old, been called to pastor a major church there in Minneapolis, is doing an incredible job. So just sitting there yesterday morning, listening to him preach and thinking about the years that he grew up was just is incredible. And so many of them, like I said now, who are heading music programs at Ivy League universities, state universities, HBCUs. So that work continues.
And how do you think things are going with the formation of church musicians today?
Not good, Mike, not good at all. COVID has put all of us in a different place and with new challenges that I don't think any of us could have ever imagined. But we are living at a time of so much uncertainty where people are so moved by the commercial industry and commercialization of music and church music and the immediacy of gratification and a lot of hype. And this is what people want. So in other words, we want to give people what they want as opposed to really being faithful to church music. Some years ago, I quoted in a plenary that I did for the Hymn Society in North Carolina. I'll never forget it. I quoted A.W. Tozer, and who said that churches that have not been taught to worship must be entertained, and those of us who lead the worship must provide that entertainment. And at that time, I had no clue of just how critical that was going to become for generations following. Nowadays, there used to be the requirements that a person learns how to play a hymn, or he or she is able to sight read or to teach and to have some basic knowledge of choral conducting, all of the things that we were trained to do. Now all of that's completely out of the window. Can you build a praise team? Can you play charts? Can you do technology? Can you energize the people with dance? And we've got to bring lights and have you work with production. So I see that being very appealing to a lot of young people who would traditionally be in churches. And then again, so many of our churches are growing. That are growing are in larger cities. And those jobs are now being taken by, in many cases, people who are less trained than their predecessors in terms of music or the training that we would consider to be essential. And there are less trained musicians who are choosing to go into church music or feel that the hymns are outdated, anthems are outdated. I know in many African-American churches, the resistance toward anything that seems Eurocentric or that seems to be imposed on them from another culture. But I'm not quite sure what it is that is taking over that, because they're not singing compositions by Black composers. In many cases, even the contemporary praise and worship are not always from Black composers, so that can't be said. Where the organ and the acoustical pianos have literally been ripped out of churches. So it's very difficult when the question comes, can you recommend someone for the church? Because musicians, our young students who are going to school, are just not being trained in that way. I am often challenged by students who say, well, I want to learn hymns, but I don't want to do the hymns like the old ones. And so I really try to engage in a conversation about that, and then look at hymns as poetry, first and foremost. Many of them, of course, are not familiar with the tremendous work of the Hymn Society and the composers who are writing texts that just literally blow them away. There are times that I have just enjoyed passing out texts and asking people to read them and like, whoa, wow, where did this come from? But these are not composers that they are being exposed to on a regular basis. And as my teacher, the late Dr. Wendell Whalum said, as leaders, you can't teach what you don't know, and you can't lead where you don't go, and you can't talk about experiences that you haven't had. So in many churches now, congregations are held hostage to the limitations of that musician, or perhaps even that pastor who has decided, God is doing a new thing, and we don't want that anymore. But what they're substituting it with is very unfortunate. I would occasionally get into trouble talking about churches that have a repertoire of 7-Elevens, and I wasn't talking about the food chains, these songs that have 7 words you sing 11 times, and then a modulate and sing them 11 more times or whatever. But very little substance, very little meat on the bones, as the Southerners would say. I find much of what is being sung to be very biblically misappropriated in some cases, theologically shallow, or in many cases just flawed. But it seems to be what's popular and what's working. I've watched the commercialization, just even in smaller churches, that they feel that there's a desired sound, or there's a desired ambiance, and it generally does not take the training that we have put into church music in the past. It's come with the talents and the gifts.
So how do you see that in relation to congregational singing?
Well, very little. I mean, I am constantly amazed by the worship services that contain absolutely no congregational singing, or if it's congregational singing, it is basically praise and worship. So this is where the leader, the praise leader, or sometimes they refer to them as the psalmist, basically sings some words and the people will give them back, or there may be a few on the screen that they sing. But in terms of actually the congregation's voice, it is it's just almost hushed because of praise teams that sing a lot of music, or soloists, quartets. Of course, during the pandemic, we have not been able to, in many churches, return to full singing in congregations. But even before that, in many cases, it was just mumbling kind of the same old hymns, and many of them have been done so poorly over the years that congregations are ready to retire them, because they've only got about 6 or 8 to retire. And so it's, but I'm amazed at how little congregational singing I hear. Beyond that, I was thinking about just my experience yesterday. I think we may have been given, over the course of that kind of gathering period, 10 or 12 words that we repeated, but that were all out of range and quite rhythmically challenging to sing. But clearly, members of the congregation are very aware of these songs, because they hear them on social media and they're able to join in with them. But for those of us who are a little seasoned, or who have been around the church, we're just kind of lost in space.
Well, you've been primary mover for 3 hymnal projects. So, you obviously have a lot to say about the kinds of things that we ought to be putting in the mouths of congregations.
Well, yeah.
Why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, when you mentioned the one Lord, one faith, one baptism, I am eternally grateful to GIA Publications, who I have been with now probably as long as we've known each other, when I was coming to NPM. But this project was extremely significant in that after about 4 or 5 years of doing some research about with various denominations in mind who I knew were either thinking of doing a new denominational hymnal or others who just clearly said they weren't going to do it, I decided that it might be a great time to bring these denominations together and really benefit from the hymnody, the rich hymnody and the styles and the traditions of all of these churches in a compilation, not to replace their denomination's hymnal, but to really serve as a supplement of contemporary hymnody that would reflect both the past, present, and future of the church. And we were very fortunate to attract the musical leadership of the African Methodist Episcopal, or the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Zion, or it's referred to as the AME Zion, Progressive Baptist, which I'm a part of, the Church of God in Christ, which was really a wonderful partner, often referred to as the Kojic Church, Pentecostal, largest Black Pentecostal movement. The Disciples of Christ, the Christian Church, was also a part of that, as well as Black Episcopalians, Black United Church of Christ, the Holiness. The Congregational UCC, and the most probably unique to all of us were Black Seventh-day Adventists. So there were actually 8 denominations and outstanding leadership. We were asked the question many times, did you all get along? We absolutely did. I think we were so busy learning from each other and sponging. If you can imagine someone like Judith McAllister, who at that time was the International Director of Music for the Church of God in Christ, excited about Dr. Carl Molesby's responsorial psalmody. And she said, wow, we could do that. I mean, our people would love this. And it was just amazing. Or to hear Jason talk about these hymns that are sung in the Seventh-day Adventists, like Watch Ye Saints. And that was just as popular as When We All Get to Heaven among Baptists. And then to hear the AME say, we need to sing that. But the most exciting thing were all of those new hymn texts by primarily writers from the Hymn Society, by my sister Mel Bringle, my brother Adam Tice, and there were just other people like Tom Troger in the text, his text. If you look in the index, when we did the showcase at the Washington University, I think when we asked the people to stand, it looked like half of the Hymn Societies represented there. But it was that people were not exposed to those texts, had no idea that these texts existed. So texts like Sing a New World Into Being now are being sung in Black churches that were looking for texts like that, or looking for texts that really, Shirley Arena Murray's God of Freedom, God of Justice, just did not know these texts. So it's been great. So I am on the road quite a bit doing, had been prior to the pandemic, doing a lot of what we call Sing to the Rafters, and we try to pull these denominations and communities together, as well as hymn festivals. In many African-American communities, hymn festivals are new. It's not that there was a resistance to it, it just hadn't happened. So having to find new ways to do old things has been exciting, but never met with any opposition. People usually leave very excited, very enlightened about it. And I think that when we're able to gather again, as we have in the past, that we will pick up from that point and move on. But we are finding, even in my congregation, ourselves singing across denominations and really strengthening and adding to our hymnody. And that was really the vision that I had for that. And I think everybody on that committee felt the same way. What was your song that we need to sing? What is it that if we had but one hymn to know from your denomination, or 2 hymns, what would it be? And it has really proven to be very exciting projects, especially for a time like now. And people are asking, well, but are people singing? Well, they will if you let them.
One of the things I hear in your description of this project is all the cross-pollination. I'm wondering what do you think about the way different cultural groups are influencing each other in the churches today, whether it's across denomination or across language, across ethnic groups? Have you seen concrete changes that?
We are. I think there's a lot of that going on. And the real challenge is the musician who is equipped to handle so many different musical languages, and that can be faithful to all of these different styles and traditions. I always equated with, as an organist, learning early French Baroque music, and the North German repertoire, and then finally getting to Bach and Buxtehude, and moving on through all of the periods of music, but then coming to the 19th century, and here comes this man César Franck, and Franck's music and his language, and then the Vidors and the Vierns and all of the harmonic language and what starts happening with them, and how you approach this. There is a commitment that an organist will learn to play stylistically well all of those various periods. Nowadays, it is rare to find a musician who is capable of being faithful to so many styles and traditions that come from other from world music, or I've had people say, I'd love to learn how to play gospel. I said, well, what type of gospel? There are about 4 or 5 different types of gospel. I probably couldn't help you much after the 80s, but to find musicians that are that musically versatile and sensitive to the stylistic and the musical idiomatic expressions that make that music what it is. We're not training musicians to do that. So in many cases, it's one or the other. It's the musician who says, well, I only read notes. If I see it on paper, I can play it. Yeah, that's what I said when Marilyn Mason first gave me the Mass of the Convent of Couperin. And I came back and I played the first 2 or 3 movements, and she sat there and she says, well, I figured you had the notes. Now we'll spend the rest of the semester learning the music. And oh, what a revelation it was. And I think about that because, we see what's on the page, but there's so much more that you need to know about music making. That's been one of the commitments that GIA has had, with particularly a lot of these commitments, trying to put little cue notes or to write arrangements as close to how they would be performed for the musician who is only able to play, or I would not say, some people call it a slave to the page, because God knows there are times we need that slavery. but then there are some that are able to improvise, but then to improvise stylistically or tastefully is equally as challenging. But then, of course, there are unfortunately a much, much larger group of people who just don't have those skills. So with all this wonderful hymnody, with all these compilations of books that come out, they're not going to mean very much to them, because they pretty much cast them aside. We've even had people ask us, I don't know why you all don't do a chord chart version of your hymnal. So, but I don't resist that. If there are congregations that might be able to expand their hymnic vocabulary, if that's what we had to do. I know we have done a number of CDs in the past to accompany Hymn Society. The hymnals, the treasured, they call it the hidden treasures hymnals. Not hymnals, the CDs that we did with the African American Heritage Hymnal, and some that we actually have a project where we're doing just a few because CDs aren't selling. But interestingly enough, there were a number of people who have very sharp ears. They'll tell you, I play by ear, and they will listen to those CDs, and before you know it, they have mastered some of the basic harmonies for some of the hymnody. So, I'm all for anything that will expand the hymnody so that we can all enjoy each other's song.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wonder if we could turn now just to the Hymn Society. You've been very active in the Hymn Society over the years, and some people may not realize you had served on the executive committee.
Yeah.
So, do you want to say a word about your involvement in the Hymn Society and what do you think?
Wow.
Place.
Well, when you said the executive board, I just thought about some of the places that we that we would have to go for pre-conference meetings, and just how fun that was. But I have tried to remember my first experience with the Hymn Society, and I can't. It looks like I've just always been there as far back as I can remember. And I have to thank for that Bob Battistini, my brother, who says, and I want you to come not just because you're on the program. I want you to come because it's a great place to learn. And certainly when I look at people like Paul Westermeyer and Paul Richardson and Michael Hahn and just countless others who are there, who we're learning. We're all thirsty, and we look forward to coming and filling up our pitchers of water so that we can be refreshed. That's what I have enjoyed doing, especially when I was not on program and able to come and glean from so many other presenters' knowledge. But the hymn festivals that I can remember, I just think probably like most members of the Hymn Society, everybody has that conference. They remember that hymn festival, that city that we were in. Or I remember when the International Hymnological Society meeting was up in Nova Scotia. That rained the whole time that we were there, and we had the bus trip that went up, and we stopped at a church, and we were singing in the rain and all of that. But I have just always enjoyed the fellowship and the singing of the group, but more importantly, just the aha moments that happen. As I said, I think you come to a certain point where you're a little dry and you are thirsty. You need to be replenished. You need to see what someone else is doing. You need to hear some fresh insight. And I have certainly found that over and over and over. I have encouraged a number of students and colleagues to attend. I said, you owe this to your congregation. Where else would you go to get this? It's not about coming to get the latest anthem or the latest gospel piece to take back to your church. I mean, there are conferences that do that, but we're committed to congregational song. And I've always felt that the primary choir of the church is the congregation, and your concern and your care for the congregation's music should be equally as important as the choir or the praise team or the quartet or ensembles or whatever else that they have. And the Hymn Society has always been consistent with that. I was so humbled and honored. I used the words of Howard Thurman when I was named a fellow of the Hymn Society, that the society had placed a crown high above my head that I would spend the rest of my life growing tall enough to wear. And I mean that because it certainly is that I'm just so motivated and inspired and enriched and enlightened by members who are doing things and who continue to do things. I am currently working on a monograph and another project, and I'm looking forward to my research leave next semester to move a little further ahead. But boy, it's like I'm I am beginning, and I'll use this, the fourth quarter of my professional career, and I want to win strong, and I'm praying for a double overtime. But I do know that this is the time that I should be doing my best work, writing the best articles, the best volumes, books. There are a lot of projects. I'm just always still fascinated by so much hymnody that has been neglected, that people just don't know, had no idea that it was there. It's just introduced to a hymn by Howard Thurman that John W. Work wrote the music for. And I'm like, wow, so the aha moments that you keep having and the adventures and the explorations into music, and how this music on the lips and in the mouths of congregants enhances and enriches the encounter with the holy, because that's what it's about. I love the fact that when you come to the Hymn Society, it is not about an ACDA choral competition. We become the audience, if for no one else but God. Our singing is to God. And I think when congregations begin to see what they do in worship, in singing, in their praying, and all as being an audience for God in worship, there's a whole different attitude, as opposed to the audience that we assume that should be entertained and should be thrilled and should be some kind of way enriched by what they have prepared for us.
Well, I've always felt that honors like fellow are ways for an organization to show what they aspire to be. And when the Hymn Society named you a fellow, I think you're an example of what we all aspire to be. I mean,
oh wow,
things you've talked about today, your scholarship, your teaching, your musicianship, all of the things that you've done and continue to do at a really breakneck pace. I think it's exactly what we want to be.
I aspire to be like so many of my colleagues in the Hymn Society. They're wonderful models, and I say that genuinely. Certainly being at a fine institution like Candler School of Theology and Emory University, all around me, I am encouraged to research, to be productive. As we say, you're only as great as your next book. And so that you're inspired to keep writing and to keep having things going. And I love being in that environment and seeing very productive and very scholarly and astute colleagues. And you want to be like that. I feel that it is my responsibility as a fellow to become more and more involved, but to certainly reach people that may not normally be reached. I'm always amazed at people who've never heard of the Hymn Society, didn't know it exists. As I said, when I do these hymn festivals and I'm going to these places and I do a text by, we sing a text by Mel Bringle or Tom Trover or Ruth Duck or just, any number of, they're like, wow, that's great. Who wrote that? And I must say, I think we had this conversation. I think it is imperative for us. I think there's an urgency, particularly in seminaries and in divinity schools, for the congregational songs to be choruses, to be revived and regenerated and renewed and refreshed. Because one thing for sure, we need hymn writers who are informed and who are able to deal with the issues of today and that are able to really address justice, peace, compassion, all of the topics sometimes that get left out of our singing. And in addition to learning the canon of hymnody, and learning about the anatomy of the hymn and so much, I think we need to start teaching some of these young theologians how to write music so that they become the next generations of Charles Wesleys and Isaac Watts and Fanny Crosby's and other people historically. Many of them didn't know, well, they were great hymn poets. They were not writing music. And many of them are very gifted poets, but certainly need direction. And I think we may be missing some wonderful opportunities to somehow come up with ways to make this attractive in seminaries and divinity schools, schools of theology, that it's not just a course for the musician, but it's one that the theologian needs to be able to check in on as well.
Well, I'm grateful for your leadership in this and the other aspects of all that we do. So thank you for this time to talk about it. I really have enjoyed talking to you today.
Well, thank you, Mike. It's my pleasure.
Well, thanks to you, and thanks to everyone who's been watching us live here this afternoon, and to all of you who will be watching the recording later. Thanks so much to everybody, and see you next month.